They thought bulldozing my home would hide their crimes. They thought fear would silence me. But the cameras they never found, the witnesses they underestimated, and the evidence they couldn't burn now point straight back at them. This wasn't destruction. This was the biggest mistake they ever made. I moved into the neighborhood believing I had finally found a quiet place where I could rebuild my life. Years of working in law enforcement had left me craving a sense of normalcy, something steady and predictable, something untouched by the chaos I faced in my job every day. The house I purchased wasn't perfect. Far from it, actually, but that was part of the appeal. It was an older property with character. A little worn, a little bruised, but with a strong foundation and potential hidden beneath the exterior. It was the kind of home that needed patience, care, and someone who understood that strength didn't always look polished. The neighborhood, however, came with an HOA. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I had dealt with worse things than a group of volunteers trying to enforce lawn care rules. My job required dealing with criminals, emergencies, and people making the worst mistakes of their lives. Compared to that, an HOA seemed harmless, maybe annoying at times, but manageable. I assumed it would be a background element in my life at best. That illusion shattered the moment I received the very first violation notice. I had been living in the house for barely 3 days when a letter appeared on my door, claiming that the exterior paint was aesthetic non-compliant. The house had chipped paint and fading colors, but it was not unsafe or hazardous in any way. The HOA's issue wasn't about safety. It was about cosmetic perfection. I shrugged it off at first, thinking it was a routine notice they automatically issued to new residents. After all, it was an older home. Renovations were already planned, and the HOA's concerns didn't seem malicious. Yet, more letters followed. One for a patch of grass that was slightly taller than regulation height. Another for construction materials placed neatly near the garage. A third one accusing me of visual disruption, because the house looked like it was undergoing prolonged repairs. That one amused me. Of course the house looked like it was being repaired. That was exactly what I was doing. But something felt different about how targeted these letters were. Other homes in the neighborhood had peeling paint or outdated siding. Some had weeds creeping around the edges of the lawn or driveways with cracks big enough to swallow pebbles. Yet I seemed to be the only one receiving violation notices daily, as if someone had singled me out the moment I moved in. It wasn't long before I realized who that someone was. The HOA president, a woman named Linda, seemed to be the nucleus of obsessive order in the community. Polished to perfection, rigid in demeanor, and blindly convinced that her vision for the neighborhood was the only acceptable standard. She was known for patrolling the streets every morning and evening, scrutinizing every property with the intensity of someone searching for evidence of wrongdoing. Her reputation wasn't hidden. Neighbors whispered about her, about the fines, the intimidation, and the pressure she applied to homeowners who resisted her demands. The intimidation didn't work on me, not because I was stubborn, but because my training made me almost immune to manipulation. I had spent years reading people, understanding their motives, recognizing patterns, and knowing exactly when someone's authority was built on nothing more than ego and insecurity. Linda's behavior wasn't about safety, beauty, or standards. It was about power. Pure, unchecked, self-gratifying power. Instead of confronting her directly, I chose to observe. It was instinctive, the same approach I used on cases. I documented everything: dates, times, photos, notes. I didn't expect things to escalate beyond typical HOA overreach, but documenting behavior had become second nature to me. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly the situation would evolve into something darker. Within 2 weeks, the letters escalated into fines. The fines grew progressively larger, jumping from minor penalties to absurd amounts meant to intimidate. I received a notice demanding immediate repainting of the entire home, even though I had already hired contractors and scheduled the work. Another notice ordered me to replace all exterior fixtures within 10 days, despite having proof that replacements were in progress. The demands were impossible to meet within their deadlines, creating the illusion of negligence even when I was actively improving the property. Neighbors began avoiding eye contact, not out of hostility, but out of fear. I could tell many of them had gone through similar experiences but had either paid the fines or complied with unreasonable demands just to avoid further conflict. The HOA board had shaped the neighborhood into a quiet, polished battleground where compliance was mandatory and resistance was punished. Still, I remained calm. There was nothing in their actions that I could not contest legally. I knew the law better than they did, and I wasn't intimidated by procedural threats. But what I didn't know was that their agenda was much larger than I first assumed. They weren't just trying to force compliance, they wanted control over the property itself. It started with whispers I overheard while walking to my car. Conversations between neighbors about the HOA's redevelopment plan. An unannounced idea for transforming older homes into modern, uniform properties that aligned with some vision Linda was pushing. No one seemed to know the details, but the idea was circulating. I began to suspect that the aggressive targeting of my home wasn't just because of aesthetics. It was because my property stood in the way of their project. My suspicions deepened when I discovered a document taped to my garage one afternoon. It was not a violation notice this time, but a final compliance demand, stating that my property was considered a structural hazard due to age and ongoing neglect. The claim was blatantly false. I had inspection reports, permits, and active construction work underway. But the HOA used vague language, unsupported accusations, and deliberately escalated threats. Something inside me shifted at that moment. What had begun as harassment was turning into something far more aggressive. I felt the same cold clarity settle into my mind that I always felt when a case evolved from inconvenience to threat. The HOA was pushing toward something extreme, something reckless, something that could only be born from the arrogance of unchallenged power. I had no idea then just how far they were willing to go. I had no idea what they were planning while I was at work, trusting that my home would be safe. I didn't know that the thin line between HOA authority and criminal destruction was about to be crossed in the most unimaginable way. But the first signs were already there, hidden in the tone of the notices, in the whispers among residents, in the quiet fear of neighbors who refused to speak openly. I sensed the shift, but I didn't yet see the storm forming behind it. The storm that would hit the day I came home to the sound of machinery. The storm that began with a bulldozer. The first sign that something was terribly wrong arrived on a morning that felt far too peaceful for what was coming. I had worked a long shift the night before, one that ran far later than expected, leaving me exhausted by the time I finally slept. By the time I woke, the sun was already high, and everything outside seemed quiet. Too quiet, in a way that didn't match the usual subtle activity of the neighborhood. I stepped outside expecting the familiar view of ongoing renovation, the half-finished siding, the tools neatly arranged beside the garage, and the sense of progress that had carried me through the last few weeks. Instead, I noticed something stranger. Multiple tire tracks imprinted in the gravel and dirt near my property line. Deep impressions, heavy machinery tracks that didn't belong to any vehicle I owned or had hired. They led toward the back of the property and disappeared behind the fence. Unease settled in my stomach. Nothing about those tracks fit the pattern of normal activity. None of my contractors had been scheduled for that day. And even if they had been, no ordinary contractor used machinery heavy enough to leave those kinds of marks without notifying the homeowner. Still, I didn't jump to conclusions. I reminded myself that assumptions were dangerous without evidence. I walked the property perimeter quietly, like I would approach a scene requiring careful observation. The further I went, the more wrong everything felt. Tools that had been organized were scattered slightly. Trash bins had been moved. A section of the fence leaned at an unnatural angle. A pattern was forming. One I didn't fully understand yet, but the instinct that guided me through years of police work was whispering that this wasn't random. This was intrusion. Someone had been here with purpose and confidence, as if they had no fear of being caught. The explanation arrived 2 hours later. Packet, thicker than usual, showed up taped to my front door. Inside was a notice marked urgent, stamped multiple times with language designed to intimidate. Violation escalation, final compliance, emergency action authorization. At first glance, it read like the previous notices, but buried deeper in the pages was something far more extreme. According to the document, The HOA had declared my property unsafe for habitation and subject to immediate corrective action, including structural removal. No inspection record was attached. No permit number. No official signature from a licensed authority. It looked official, but it was nothing more than the HOA's fabricated paperwork. A thin veil of authority masking a blatant abuse of power. The escalation was beyond anything reasonable. Unsafe for habitation? Structural removal? None of those phrases aligned with reality. I had inspections, permits, and progress logs. My home was old but stable. My repairs were legal, inspected, and documented. The HOA, however, was trying to create an emergency where none existed. As I read through the pages, I began connecting threads I hadn't seen earlier. The repeated targeting, the inflated fines, the sudden urgency, the whispers about redevelopment plans. The behavior now fit a pattern not of rule enforcement, but of property acquisition by force and intimidation. They didn't just want compliance, they wanted my land. But wanting my land and committing the next act they were planning were two entirely different things. That afternoon, I left for work earlier than usual with the intention of stopping by the city office afterward to report the fake documentation. I also planned to request an official inspection to invalidate the HOA's claims once and for all. I felt confident that I could dismantle their tactics through proper channels. I had the knowledge, the training, and the evidence. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly the HOA was moving behind my back. While I was at work, a call came in through my personal phone. I didn't recognize the number, so I couldn't answer immediately. When I stepped aside during a quiet moment and checked the voicemail, my blood ran cold. The message was filled with noise, mechanical rumbling, cracking, and the deep growl of heavy machinery. Then a frantic voice shouted over the chaos, trying to warn me that something was happening at my home. The voicemail was barely audible, but the one word that came through clearly was bulldozer. I didn't stop to think. I didn't question. Instinct took over. Years of responding to emergencies, of reading danger in the smallest details, surged through me. I left immediately, adrenaline pounding through my veins as I sped back toward the neighborhood. Every second felt stretched, the road blurring, my thoughts sharpened into a narrow point of focus. I had dealt with criminals, violent offenders, and dangerous situations, but nothing prepared me for the cold dread of knowing my home. My safe place, the one thing I had chosen to rebuild my life in, was under attack by the very people who claimed to protect the community. When I turned into the neighborhood, I saw the gathering crowd before I saw the machine. Neighbors stood frozen on the sidewalks, some recording, others whispering in horror, all watching something that made my pulse spike even more. The closer I got, the clearer the scene became. A massive piece of machinery, a full-size construction bulldozer, was parked directly against the front of my home. Parts of the porch had already collapsed under the weight of its metal blade. Dust covered the air. Boards hung at broken angles. My belongings were exposed, scattered, ruined. And standing proudly in front of it all was Linda, the HOA president, clipboard in hand, overseeing the destruction as if it were a scheduled event. For a split second, everything inside me went silent. No thoughts, no reactions, only a hollow disbelief that felt like a vacuum sucking the air from my lungs. Then the silence shattered into a cold, controlled fury. I could feel the shift inside myself, the same shift I experienced at scenes where the line between negligence and crime had been crossed. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't miscommunication. This was a deliberate, reckless act of destruction. And they had done it thinking I was powerless. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know what I was capable of. They didn't know the laws they had just broken. They didn't know that the one man they chose to target was the one man trained to dismantle people who abused authority. Everything was about to change. And as I stepped toward the ruins of my home, the neighborhood watched in uneasy silence, sensing that whatever happened next would shake the foundation of the HOA forever. The moment I stepped into the wreckage of my front yard, the world seemed to slow into a heavy, crushing stillness. The dust in the air swirled around me, illuminated by the harsh sunlight, settling onto the splintered remains of wood, shattered concrete, and the scattered fragments of my belongings. The bulldozer sat motionless, its blade lowered into the front wall, as if proudly displaying the damage it had inflicted. It was a grotesque monument to the arrogance of the HOA, a physical manifestation of their belief that they could act without consequence. Neighbors stood frozen at a safe distance, some torn between curiosity and fear. Many of them knew something was wrong long before today, but none dared to challenge the board. Their silence was understandable. Years of intimidation had trained them to avoid conflict. But now, as they watched the unfolding disaster, the facade of HOA authority was beginning to crack in their eyes. I walked slowly around the bulldozer, noting the tire marks, the angle of the blade, the crushed porch, the splintered siding. Every detail told a story, a timeline of destruction they had initiated without hesitation. The damage wasn't accidental or minimal. It was extensive, intentional, and executed with a sense of entitlement that made my jaw tighten with controlled anger. Linda stood near the machine, clipboard held like a badge of superiority. She didn't move when she saw me. She didn't flinch. She simply assumed that whatever happened today would end the way all previous confrontations had ended. The homeowner backing down, defeated by the HOA's fabricated authority. She had no idea the dynamic had shifted the moment I arrived. But I didn't lash out. Anger without strategy was useless. I relied instead on the one thing that had always set me apart in my job: calm observation under pressure. I turned away from her entirely and began documenting the scene. Quietly, systematically, methodically. My phone captured everything. The bulldozer's identification numbers, the condition of the property before I left that morning, the tracks across my yard, the destroyed portion of my home, and the crowd of witnesses who watched silently. If they believed destroying my house would intimidate me, they had fatally miscalculated. They had handed me evidence, layers of it, more damning than anything I could have hoped to gather through normal channels. And they didn't know I had been documenting them long before today. Months earlier, when the harassment first began, I had already sensed something deeper than petty rule enforcement. The frequency of the violations, the escalations without justification, the contradictory demands, they all pointed to a coordinated attempt to target my property. With my background, my instincts told me to prepare. So I had installed cameras around my home. Visible ones at the front and smaller, nearly invisible ones at the back, sides, and near the garage. Those cameras had captured everything leading up to the demolition. The early morning intrusion. The unauthorized inspection by board members carrying clipboards. The meeting between the HOA's hired contractor and Linda. The bulldozer being moved onto my property before they even taped the false emergency notice to my door. They had planned the demolition long before notifying me. I had footage of the entire sequence. But the most damning part wasn't the physical destruction. It was the fabricated claim of structural unsafety. They had declared my home unsafe without a licensed inspector, without city authorization, without any legal process. And they had done it with the confidence of people who believed no one could ever hold them accountable. As I walked deeper into the torn entryway of my home, the sight of my personal belongings crushed beneath debris fueled a quiet, icy resolve within me. Years of memories, personal items, materials I needed for renovation, all reduced to rubble. It wasn't just the physical damage, it was the violation of privacy, the trespass, the destruction of something I had chosen specifically as a place of healing. My boots crunched against broken wood and drywall as I examined the interior. Despite the exterior damage, the internal structure was still mostly intact, proof that the house had never been unsafe, as they had claimed. The bulldozer had destroyed walls, but the frame, the beams, the areas untouched by the blade all showed stability. Their entire justification had been a lie from the beginning. Outside, I could feel the tension building. The crowd was waiting for an explosion, a confrontation that would match the intensity of the destruction. But confrontation wasn't my immediate focus. My goal was evidence, clean, irrefutable evidence. I knew the law better than any of them. I knew the procedures, and I knew exactly what steps to take before involving external authorities. Before I left for work earlier, I had turned on the house's surveillance system manually, an instinctive habit I followed whenever something unusual occurred. Every camera had recorded hours of footage that would show the HOA's illegal actions, from trespassing to property damage to unauthorized contracting. I moved through the house with calm precision, checking the camera mounts and ensuring that even the devices that had been partially damaged still held their data. Some had been knocked from the walls, but the memory storage remained intact. I collected them all carefully. Meanwhile, a quiet shift occurred among the neighbors. Their uncertain expressions shifted into something else: recognition. A few of them already knew I worked in law enforcement, though many didn't know the specifics. My measured response, my lack of panic, my instinctual evidence gathering, all were signs that I was not just another intimidated resident. They could see the tide turning. I stepped back outside, carrying what remained of the equipment, and the atmosphere grew heavier. Linda's confident posture wavered slightly. For the first time since I moved into the neighborhood, she looked unsure. Her board members stood behind her, clutching their papers tightly, attempting to maintain authority. But the reality of what they had done was beginning to seep into their expressions. Small cracks of worry forming at the edges. They expected fear, anger, or defeat. But what they got was calm, deliberate calculation. I knew exactly what charges they had just committed: criminal trespassing, property damage, fraudulent documentation, unsafe operation of heavy machinery without permit, reckless endangerment, conspiracy to misuse HOA authority. And that was only the beginning. There were statutes, civil liabilities, and regulatory violations layered beneath it all, waiting to be uncovered. What they didn't know, what none of them realized, was that they had just turned a petty feud into a full-scale criminal investigation. Not by my doing, but by their own arrogance. And they still didn't know the most important fact of all. They didn't know I was a police officer trained specifically in dismantling organized fraud and abuse of authority. They didn't know that their every action, their planning, their trespassing, their demolition, had already been captured and backed up. They didn't know that they had just become subjects of a case far bigger than an HOA dispute. As I stared at the bulldozer, the rubble, and the trembling HOA board, I knew this moment wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the unraveling of everything they had built their power on. The dust from the demolished house still hung in the morning air long after the bulldozer had been shut down. The barren slab of concrete, cracked under the weight of machinery and negligence, looked nothing like the home Mark had spent months restoring. Wooden fragments lay scattered around the yard like bones from something violently torn apart. Yet in the middle of the destruction, it was the silence that struck him most. The kind of silence that follows disaster, when no one dares move or breathe for fear of drawing attention to their guilt. The HOA board members remained frozen, their expressions suspended between confusion and dread. They hadn't expected him to arrive so quickly. They hadn't anticipated that the homeowner whose property they had just destroyed would return while the machines were still warm. And above all, they had never imagined that the quiet man they had been harassing for months was someone trained to assess scenes like these, not as a victim, but as an investigator. Mark surveyed the wreckage with a measured calm. Nothing about his demeanor signaled panic or rage. Instead, he approached the scene the way a seasoned detective approaches a crime, methodically. He walked the perimeter of the property, mentally noting every displaced beam, every torn pipe, every section of foundation the bulldozer had ruptured. The tracks carved deep into the soil formed a clear timeline of destruction, revealing precisely how the machine had advanced across the property. Each track, each imprint, each pattern was a piece of evidence. His cameras, installed weeks prior, had caught everything. The footage had captured the HOA members meeting secretly in the cul-de-sac before dawn, discussing their plan to demolish the house under the guise of non-compliance. It had recorded them directing the bulldozer operator, pointing toward the structure as though it were an obstacle ruining their suburban fantasy. It had documented the moment the machine began its assault, splintering the front wall and collapsing the frame with ruthless force. They believed they were acting with impunity. They believed no one would dare challenge them. But every moment of their unlawful demolition had been carefully preserved, copied, time-stamped, and backed up to multiple secure drives. Nothing was lost. Nothing was misinterpreted. There was no angle, no detail, no misplaced shadow that could provide them the slightest defense. Mark stood at the center of the ruin, reflecting on the significance of what had happened. This wasn't just property damage. It wasn't just harassment. It was a coordinated act carried out by an HOA board abusing its authority to an extreme degree. Their behavior wasn't rooted in neighborhood management. It was rooted in ego, greed, and a belief that they were untouchable. But now the evidence held a different truth. He understood the gravity of what needed to happen next. The HOA board had crossed from petty harassment into criminal territory. Their trespassing, vandalism, conspiracy, and unauthorized demolition constituted violations far beyond the jurisdiction of homeowner regulations. They were now subjects of a full-scale criminal investigation. Over the next few hours, Mark documented the scene in its entirety. He photographed every remaining structure fragment, every piece of shattered glass, every exposed wire. He recorded the bulldozer's identification number, its location, and the debris stuck beneath its treads. He captured the expressions of the board members: shock, fear, dawning realization. The integrity of the documentation mattered, not just for personal record but for what would come after. The HOA members, once bold and domineering, began to scatter once they realized he wasn't reacting like an ordinary homeowner. Their whispers faltered. Their postures collapsed. One quietly stepped away. Another pretended to take a phone call. The connection between them began to fracture, each recognizing that staying together only strengthened their implication in the event. Mark paid no attention to their attempts to withdraw. The truth was already recorded. Their panic only confirmed by the time he finished surveying the damage. The sun had risen fully. Neighbors had emerged cautiously from behind curtains and doorways. Some approached with hesitant glances, others with sympathetic nods. Many had experienced their own share of mistreatment at the hands of the HOA, but none had ever witnessed an escalation like this. Their silence was heavy, not from indifference but from long-standing exhaustion and fear. With the evidence secured, Mark turned his focus to the next step: formal reporting. As a police officer, he knew the procedures intimately. He filed the initial notification through the proper channels, providing an objective summary of the incident without emotion or embellishment. Then he submitted the footage, the documents, and the photographs as part of the incoming case. It took only minutes before the seriousness of the situation was understood by those receiving the files. Investigators were dispatched to the scene shortly afterward. They examined the bulldozer, interviewed witnesses, and assessed the damage with the same careful precision he had used earlier. Their presence marked the transition from private violation to public accountability. It was no longer a dispute between Mark and the HOA. It was a matter of criminal conduct under state jurisdiction. While the officers documented the scene, Mark stepped aside, observing. He sensed the shift occurring around him. Neighbors who had once avoided challenging the HOA now approached, compelled by the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Their frustration and fear had fermented for years, and the demolition seemed to break something within them that it wasn't just his home that had been destroyed. It was the false sense of power the HOA had built. Several neighbors came forward to provide statements, revealing years of intimidation, fabricated violations, illegal fines, and privacy invasions. Their testimonies added layers to the case, painting a picture of an HOA that had long operated as a personal dictatorship rather than a legitimate governing body. The board's actions were no longer isolated incidents, they were patterns. Meanwhile, the HOA board members who remained at the scene grew increasingly restless. Their attempts to justify themselves faltered as the weight of evidence mounted. Some seemed desperate to shift blame. Others appeared numb, as though finally recognizing the consequences of their unchecked influence. The president, once the figurehead of control, no longer commanded authority. The collapse of her power was evident in the way she avoided eye contact and trembled under the scrutiny of investigators. Mark understood that the process ahead would be long. Cases of this magnitude required time, patience, and clarity. But he also knew that the path had been set in motion. The HOA's downfall had begun, not through retaliation, but through the truth they had created with their own actions. As the day progressed and the investigation deepened, Mark felt a strange calm wash over him. The destruction of his home had been devastating, but the demolition had inadvertently lit a fuse that would expose everything the HOA had hidden for years. Their secret dealings, illegal amendments, financial mismanagement, and coercive tactics would soon come to light. This wasn't the end. It wasn't even close. It was the start of a dismantling far larger than the ruined structure behind him. The unraveling had truly begun. In the days following the demolition, the community shifted into a state of tense anticipation. The once feared HOA, previously regarded as the immovable force controlling every aspect of neighborhood life, now found itself under a spotlight far brighter than any of them had imagined. Their authority, once unquestioned, now appeared brittle, fragile under the weight of scrutiny, evidence, and collective resentment. Mark watched events unfold with the same disciplined patience he had relied on throughout his career. The investigative team assigned to the case worked steadily, collecting statements, reviewing the footage, and reconstructing the timeline of the HOA's unlawful decision. The evidence was overwhelming, each piece reinforcing a narrative of negligence, recklessness, and deliberate misuse of power. While the police investigation progressed, another force began to emerge, one that the HOA had never anticipated. The community itself, quiet for so long, had begun to awaken. Neighbors who once lowered their heads when passing the HOA president now walked with a newfound boldness. They attended meetings they had previously avoided. They whispered openly on sidewalks about the board's corruption, their voices louder each day. Years of pent-up frustration flowed freely now that someone had finally taken a stand. The HOA board attempted to salvage their authority, but the foundation of their power had cracked. Their official announcements, once rigid and commanding, now sounded desperate. Their attempts to justify their actions unraveled under the weight of logic and evidence. Even the members who had blindly supported the president for years began to distance themselves, unwilling to be part of something collapsing in real time. The president herself, once the center of every decision, began to retreat. Her presence in the neighborhood diminished noticeably. Her confident walks were replaced with hurried movements, avoiding eye contact with residents who now watched her with suspicion or outright contempt. The demolition had not only exposed her actions, it had exposed the rot beneath her entire administration. As the community's resistance grew, residents stepped forward with stories that painted a clear picture of long-standing abuse. Some spoke of fines issued without proper review, others of threats when they questioned decisions, and many of how they had felt powerless for years. The investigators compiled these accounts, forming a broader narrative of a board that had operated far outside its legal boundaries. Mark became a quiet focal point of this movement. Though he never positioned himself as a leader, the community naturally gravitated toward him for support, direction, and reassurance. His calm demeanor, even in the aftermath of losing his home, inspired a collective sense of resolve. They understood now that the HOA's tyranny could be challenged, and that the first step had already been taken. With the investigation underway, the local government also took interest. Regulatory bodies launched audits into the HOA's financial records. Years of unexplained expenses, suspicious transfers, and missing funds began to surface. The president's personal involvement in these irregularities became increasingly evident, adding yet another layer to the case against her. The situation escalated further when investigators reviewed the HOA's documentation of Mark's supposed violations. Not only were many of the citations fabricated, but several signatures on official documents were forged. This discovery triggered a deeper probe, one that extended beyond the incident at Mark's home and into the legal validity of the HOA's operations. The board's veneer of professionalism dissolved. Meetings were no longer composed displays of self-assured authority. They were chaotic, disorganized, and marked by panic. Residents attended in record numbers, demanding answers the board could no longer provide. The president, once unshakable, struggled to maintain control. Her voice, once commanding, now shook with uncertainty. For Mark, watching this unraveling was not satisfying in the way one might expect. There was no sense of triumph, no thrill in witnessing the downfall of those who had wronged him. Instead, There was a sober understanding that what he was seeing was the inevitable consequence of unchecked power. It reaffirmed what he had always known. Authority must be held accountable, whether it exists in a police department, a government office, or a homeowners association. While the investigation unfolded, Mark faced the personal challenge of rebuilding his life in the aftermath of the demolition. Temporary housing provided him shelter, but the absence of his home, the space he had repaired with his own hands, hung heavily in the background. Yet even in that loss he found clarity. The demolition had stripped away not just the physical structure but also the illusion that homes were safe from abuse by those in power. Now, he understood that rebuilding meant far more than restoring walls and a roof. It meant ensuring that no one else in the community would suffer the way he had. The investigators eventually compiled their findings into a comprehensive report. It detailed not only the events leading to the demolition but also the systemic corruption perpetuated by the HOA board. The report recommended criminal charges against several members, including the president. The severity of the charges ranged from conspiracy to property destruction to financial misconduct. When the warrants were issued, the community felt an undeniable shift. It was the moment many had silently hoped for but never believed would come. Mark watched as officers escorted the board members from the neighborhood, an image that symbolized the end of an era defined by intimidation and control. The president's fall was swift. Her carefully crafted reputation crumbled in an instant. The power she wielded so confidently evaporated, replaced with consequences she had never anticipated. The community she claimed to protect now saw her clearly, as someone who had exploited her authority for personal satisfaction and control. In the days that followed, an interim committee was formed to restore order. Residents who had long been afraid to speak now stepped into leadership roles. They focused on rebuilding trust, repairing damaged relationships, and ensuring transparency in all decisions. The association, once a source of fear, slowly transformed into something more balanced and accountable. Amid these changes, Mark remained steady. His involvement was crucial, not because he sought recognition but because his experience had provided the clarity needed to reshape the community's governance. He attended meetings, offered guidance when requested, and supported neighbors beginning their own journeys to reclaim their sense of security. But despite the progress, one lingering task remained: rebuilding his home. And that chapter was approaching sooner than anyone expected. The demolition had started the unraveling. The rebuilding would mark the restoration. Months passed, marked by steady progress and quiet transformation. What had once been a community suffocated under the weight of a tyrannical HOA had begun to emerge into something more balanced, fair, and humane. The fear that had once clung to the neighborhood like a silent shadow slowly lifted with each passing week. Residents who had endured years of intimidation finally felt the freedom to live without the constant dread of fines, surveillance, or petty punishment. For Mark, the journey had been far more personal. The destruction of his home had initially felt like an enormous void, a sudden, violent erasure of something he was building not just as a structure, but as a refuge. Yet as time went on, he began to understand that the demolition had also cleared something intangible. The illusion that power would always be misused, that corruption was inevitable, and that standing alone against injustice was futile. Because in his case, standing alone had inspired others to stand with him. The legal proceedings against the former HOA president and several board members moved forward with deliberate pace. Evidence from the demolition, along with years of misconduct collected from residents and financial audits, created a case so comprehensive that it left little room for ambiguity. The charges resulted in convictions that removed them permanently from any position of authority within the community, and in some cases, barred them from holding similar positions anywhere else. The community expressed a collective sense of closure as justice was served. Yet for Mark, closure came not in courtrooms but in the steady rise of new wooden beams on his property. The day construction began on his new home marked a turning point. The empty lot that had sat barren for months finally echoed with the sounds of hammers, drills, and rising structure. It was not just rebuilding, it was reclamation. Each day he visited the site, observing the progress with calm determination. Workers reconstructed the frame piece by piece, ensuring the new home was sturdier and more resilient than the one that had fallen. The foundation was reinforced, the materials stronger, the design more refined. Where debris and dust had covered the ground months before, new walls rose tall and straight. The transformation was gradual but meaningful, mirroring the changes within the community itself. Neighbors frequently visited the site, offering support, encouragement, and help where they could. Some brought meals to the workers, others volunteered for tasks such as painting or landscaping. Their involvement was not out of obligation, but out of shared gratitude. An acknowledgement that Mark's perseverance had exposed the truth and helped restore fairness to a place that had been governed by fear. The interim HOA committee continued its efforts to rebuild trust within the neighborhood. Transparency meetings became the norm, financial statements were made accessible to all residents, and decisions were reached collaboratively rather than imposed. The days of rigid enforcement and selective punishment were replaced with cooperation and collective problem-solving. Even the simplest neighborly interactions felt different now. Lighter, more genuine, no longer overshadowed by the threat of arbitrary authority. As the house neared completion, Mark reflected on everything that had transpired. The destruction had been violent and unexpected, yet without it, the corruption festering beneath the surface might never have been exposed. The community would have remained silent, burdened by a system designed to suppress dissent. Sometimes he realized the collapse of a structure, whether physical or organizational, was necessary to reveal what needed rebuilding. By the time the final inspections were completed, the new house stood proudly where the old one had fallen. The design paid quiet homage to what was lost, but with improvements that reflected resilience. The yard was landscaped carefully, the porch extended, and the interior constructed with meticulous attention to detail. Everything was new, but nothing felt unfamiliar. It was a continuation of what he had begun years before, carried through with even greater purpose. On the morning he moved back in, the neighborhood gathered outside, forming an informal welcome. They watched as Mark stepped onto his new porch for the first time, their presence a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had all witnessed. The moment wasn't celebratory in a loud or extravagant way. It held a quiet power, the kind that emerges after surviving something difficult together. Once inside, Mark took a moment to absorb the stillness. The walls were bare, the rooms empty, but the space felt whole, felt earned. The demolition had taken away a home, but the rebuilding had restored far more. It had given him clarity, justice, and a community transformed. As he walked through the rooms, he understood that the story didn't end with the house standing again. It ended with a reminder that power, when left unchecked, can destroy, but when challenged with truth, discipline, and patience, it can be dismantled and replaced with something stronger. The HOA that had once terrorized its residents was gone, replaced by a body that understood its purpose, to serve, not dominate. The president who once ruled the community with ego and fear now faced the consequences of her actions, and the man they had underestimated, whose home they destroyed, whose life they tried to disrupt, stood again on solid ground, his resolve intact. What began with the roar of a bulldozer ended with the quiet assurance of justice fulfilled. The unraveling had completed its course. The rebuilding had restored what mattered. And the community, once broken, now stood united because one man refused to be silenced and in doing so, changed everything.